Sarah believed tonight was going to be a celebration of love and commitment, but the truth would soon shatter her world. For 10 years, Sarah had lived what she thought was the ideal life. Married to Mike, the love of her life, they built a comfortable existence in their quiet suburban neighborhood with their 2 children. Their family felt picture perfect. Mike was the devoted husband, a successful businessman who worked hard to provide for them, while Sarah managed their home and cared for the kids. She always trusted Mike's long hours, and business trips were simply part of his drive to secure their future. But lately, things had changed. Sarah couldn't help but notice Mike's increasing distance. He seemed distracted, his phone always nearby, face down on the table, and there were more late-night texts and hushed phone calls than before. Whenever she brought it up, Mike would brush off her concerns, blaming it on work stress. Sarah, trusting and ever hopeful, tried to dismiss the doubts growing in her mind. But one thing lingered in the back of her thoughts: Emma, the babysitter. Emma had been a fixture in their lives for years, almost like family. She was young, reliable, and great with the kids. Sarah trusted her completely. But lately, Sarah had noticed subtle changes in the way Mike interacted with her. The laughter between them seemed a little too easy. Their glances lingered a little too long. As their 10-year anniversary approached, Sarah threw herself into planning the celebration. She wanted to make it unforgettable, a testament to the life they had built together. Friends and family were invited, and Sarah meticulously arranged every detail. But as she worked to create a perfect night, the cracks in her seemingly perfect life began to widen. In the weeks leading up to the anniversary party, Sarah's life became a blur of preparations. Between managing the kids, working, and organizing the celebration, she barely had time to breathe. Yet amidst all the excitement, her unease about Mike's behavior only grew stronger. The late nights, the distant looks, and the secretive phone habits no longer felt like small concerns. Something was undeniably off. One evening, while tidying up the bedroom, Sarah found something she couldn't ignore. Nestled in the carpet near Mike's side of the bed was a delicate earring. It didn't belong to her, and she was certain it didn't belong to any of her friends who had visited. For a moment, she tried to brush it off, telling herself it could have been misplaced or accidentally dropped by someone. But deep down, she knew the truth was far more complicated. Sarah didn't confront Mike immediately. Instead, she slipped the earring into her jewelry box, where it sat like a nagging reminder of the doubts she had been suppressing for months. Each time she opened the box, the earring seemed to stare back at her, demanding an explanation. And with every passing day, Sarah's mind circled back to one person: Emma. Emma had always seemed harmless. Sarah had never suspected anything inappropriate between her and Mike. But now, as she replayed memories of their interactions, things began to feel suspicious. She recalled the way Emma had laughed a little too hard at Mike's jokes, how their casual glances now seemed more intimate than they should be. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Emma was more involved in Mike's life than she had realized. As the anniversary party drew closer, Sarah tried to focus on the celebration. She told herself she was overreacting, that she was letting her imagination run wild. After all, Emma had been part of their family for years. She couldn't be the reason for Sarah's growing doubts about Mike, could she? Yet, the signs were becoming impossible to ignore. Mike's behavior only became more guarded. His phone was always locked, and he seemed to be pulling away emotionally. Their once strong connection felt strained, as though something or someone had come between them. Determined to hold on to what they had, Sarah tried to suppress her growing suspicion. She wanted to believe in the life they had built, in the love that had once seemed so unshakable. The anniversary party was her chance to reaffirm their bond, to remind Mike, and maybe even herself, of the life they had shared for 10 years. But deep down, Sarah couldn't escape the sinking feeling that something was terribly wrong. Every time she looked at Mike, every time she saw Emma, that gnawing suspicion grew louder. The earring sat in her jewelry box like a ticking time bomb, and Sarah knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. As the anniversary party loomed ever closer, Sarah found herself caught in a web of doubts and suspicions that she couldn't shake. Despite her efforts to focus on the celebration, Mike's behavior continued to erode her confidence. The man who once seemed so attentive and loving had grown increasingly distant. Their conversations became shallow, and moments of genuine affection between them had all but disappeared. Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the earring she had found. She hadn't brought it up with Mike, afraid of how he might react. What if she was wrong? What if there was a simple explanation and she was just imagining things? When Emma came over to watch the children, Mike always found a reason to talk to her, even if it was just small talk. Their interactions felt too easy, too familiar. One evening, Sarah caught a glance of Emma wearing earrings that looked eerily similar to the one she had found by Mike's bedside. Her heart pounded, and she quickly turned away, trying to push the thought out of her mind. It couldn't be Emma's, could it? The idea of her husband betraying her with the babysitter felt too absurd, too outrageous. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and now it was growing into something Sarah could no longer ignore. Unable to bear the silence between them, Sarah finally worked up the courage to ask Mike what had been going on. One night, as they sat on the couch after dinner, she gently brought up her concerns. She mentioned his distant behavior, the late nights, and how she had been feeling uneasy about it all. Mike's reaction was immediate. He brushed her concerns aside with a casual wave of his hand, claiming that work had just been more demanding than usual. He assured her that there was nothing to worry about, that she was reading too much into things. But his words lacked the warmth and sincerity they once had, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't telling her the whole truth. When she asked him directly if there was something going on with Emma, Mike's expression changed. He laughed it off, telling Sarah that she was being ridiculous, that Emma was just the babysitter. But the way he avoided eye contact, the way his voice sounded strained, it all confirmed Sarah's worst fears. Something was wrong, and for the first time, Sarah began to seriously consider that the life she had trusted for so long was a lie. As the anniversary party approached, Sarah felt like she was living in a waking nightmare. She was surrounded by friends, family, and the man she had once loved more than anything, but none of it felt real anymore. There was a chasm between her and Mike, a rift she couldn't cross. And no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to come crashing down. The day of the anniversary party had finally arrived, and Sarah was determined to make it a night to remember, even if her heart was heavy with suspicion. The venue was perfectly decorated, filled with beautiful flowers and candlelight. Friends and family gathered, all there to celebrate a milestone that now felt like a painful reminder of how much her life had changed. Despite the turmoil swirling inside her, Sarah put on a brave face. She greeted the guests warmly, making small talk and thanking them for coming. Everyone complimented her on the party's perfect organization, unaware of the emotional chaos simmering beneath her composed exterior. Emma had arrived early, offering to help with the children as usual. Seeing her made Sarah's stomach churn, but she forced herself to smile. Emma was cheerful and radiant, just as she always was. It felt almost cruel to have her here, at the heart of a celebration that was supposed to honor Sarah and Mike's marriage. Yet Emma seemed completely at ease, unaware, or perhaps uncaring, of the dark thoughts consuming Sarah. As the party progressed, Sarah's attention was constantly drawn to Mike and Emma. She watched as they exchanged glances from across the room, seemingly innocent but now filled with a weight that Sarah couldn't ignore. Every time Emma laughed at one of Mike's jokes or leaned in just a little too close, Sarah's heart twisted. Mike, for his part, was playing the role of the perfect husband, mingling with guests, sharing stories, and laughing like nothing was wrong. But to Sarah, his charm felt forced, hollow. She couldn't help but wonder how long he had been pretending, how long he had been hiding the truth from her. As the evening wore on, the tension inside Sarah built like a storm ready to break. She moved through the crowd, smiling and nodding at guests, but her mind was miles away. She found herself going over every interaction, every conversation she had witnessed between Mike and Emma, searching for clues, for something to confirm what she already feared. At one point, Sarah retreated to the kitchen, needing a moment to catch her breath. She stood there alone, gripping the counter, her mind racing. She couldn't go on like this, living in doubt, constantly questioning the man she had built her life with. The earring, the secretive behavior, the distant looks. It was all too much. Sarah knew she couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. Something had to give. Just then, Emma entered the kitchen, her usual bright smile lighting up her face. "Everything looks amazing, Sarah," she said casually, as if nothing in the world could be wrong. "You've really outdone yourself." Sarah forced a tight smile, nodding in response. "Thanks, Emma. It's been a lot of work." For a moment, there was an uncomfortable silence between them, and Sarah's heart raced. She wanted to confront her right then and there, to ask her if the earring was hers, if there was something going on between her and Mike. But she held back. This wasn't the time or place, at least not yet. Emma, sensing the tension, glanced at Sarah with a hint of concern. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her tone soft. Sarah hesitated, her emotions swirling inside her. "I'm fine," she lied, offering another strained smile. "Just tired." With a sympathetic nod, Emma turned and left the kitchen, leaving Sarah alone once more with her thoughts. But the confrontation Sarah had been dreading was inching closer, and she knew that by the end of the night there would be no more running from the truth. As the party reached its peak, the atmosphere inside the venue was lively and full of celebration. Guests laughed and raised their glasses in toasts to Sarah and Mike's 10 years of marriage. To everyone else, it was a perfect night, an evening celebrating love and commitment. But for Sarah, every moment felt like it was dragging her closer to a confrontation she couldn't avoid. She watched as Mike moved through the room with his usual charm, laughing with friends, telling stories, and playing the role of the devoted husband. But his smile no longer seemed genuine to her. The disconnect between his outward persona and the growing suspicion inside her heart felt unbearable. Emma, always nearby, caught Sarah's eye more often than not. It was impossible to ignore how comfortable she seemed around Mike, how they shared subtle, unspoken moments that made Sarah's stomach churn. As much as Sarah tried to push it aside, the weight of her suspicions had become too heavy to ignore. Sarah's thoughts kept returning to the earring in her jewelry box. She had found it near Mike's side of the bed, a place where it should never have been. The thought that it might belong to Emma had gnawed at her for weeks, and now, standing in the middle of the celebration, it was all she could think about. Finally, Sarah knew she couldn't wait any longer. The doubts, the lies, everything was building up inside her, threatening to break free in front of everyone. She couldn't stand another minute of pretending. It was time to confront the truth. Just as one of Mike's friends, David, stood to make a toast, Sarah's resolve solidified. The room quieted as David raised his glass, speaking warmly of Mike and Sarah's life together. "Here's to 10 wonderful years, and to many more to come," he declared, his smile broad as the guests erupted into applause. Sarah felt Mike's arm slip around her waist as he leaned in, whispering, "I love you." But the words felt empty, hollow, and the weight of her doubts pressed harder than ever. she smiled back, though it was nothing more than a mask. She couldn't do this anymore. As the applause died down and the guests returned to their conversations, Sarah made her decision. She gently pulled away from Mike's embrace, her heart pounding in her chest as she crossed the room toward Emma. The time for silence had passed. She needed answers, now. "Emma," Sarah said as she reached her, her voice low but firm. Emma turned, her smile as bright and cheerful as ever, completely unaware of what was about to unfold. "Hey, Sarah. Everything's amazing tonight," Emma said, oblivious to the tension in Sarah's voice. But Sarah didn't engage in pleasantries. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the earring, the one she had found weeks ago near Mike's bedside. She held it up, watching as Emma's eyes widened in recognition. "Is this yours?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Emma's expression shifted, her smile faltering as she stared at the earring in Sarah's hand. The silence between them was heavy, charged with unspoken truths. Emma opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She glanced nervously around the room, as if searching for an escape, but there was none. The truth was out now, and Sarah wasn't going to let her avoid it. "I found this in my bedroom," Sarah continued, her voice tight with barely contained anger, "next to Mike's side of the bed." The color drained from Emma's face, and for the first time, the cheerful, carefree mask she had worn for so long slipped away, revealing the guilt beneath. Sarah didn't need to hear her say it. The truth was written all over Emma's face. The room seemed to shrink around Sarah and Emma as the weight of the revelation settled between them. Sarah's pulse quickened, her grip tightening on the earring. She waited for Emma to speak, but the young woman's eyes were filled with panic, darting from Sarah's face to the earring, as if searching for a way to deny the undeniable. Sarah wasn't going to let her get away with silence. "I asked you a question," she said, her voice trembling slightly but filled with determination. "Is this your earring?" Before Emma could answer, Sarah felt Mike's presence beside her. His hand gently touched her arm, and he spoke in a tone that was far too casual for the situation. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice laced with forced calm. Sarah turned to look at him, her eyes locking with his. She could see the flicker of panic in his eyes, quickly masked by his usual charm. But this time, his smooth demeanor wouldn't save him. She had waited long enough for the truth, and she wasn't going to be swayed by his reassurances any longer. "I found this earring by your side of the bed," Sarah said, holding it up so both Mike and Emma could see. "And Emma isn't denying that it's hers." Mike's smile wavered for a split second before he quickly recovered. "Sarah, come on. This is ridiculous. It's just an earring, probably one of your friends or something. You're overreacting." But Sarah wasn't backing down. She could feel the crowd around them beginning to sense that something was happening. Whispers floated through the room, and some guests turned their attention toward the unfolding confrontation. "I'm overreacting?" Sarah repeated, her voice rising. "Then explain why this was in our bedroom, Mike. Explain why Emma's been around you so much, why you've been distant, secretive, always hiding your phone." Mike's calm facade was starting to crack. "Sarah, this is not the time or place for this," he said, his tone becoming more urgent as he glanced around at the watching guests. "Let's go somewhere private and talk." "No," Sarah said firmly. "We're not doing this in private anymore. I've been in the dark long enough." She turned back to Emma, who was standing frozen, her face pale, her hands trembling. "How long?" Sarah demanded, her voice sharp. "How long has this been going on?" Emma opened her mouth, but the words wouldn't come. She looked at Mike, silently pleading with him to step in, to deflect the blame, to offer her a way out. But Mike was just as trapped as she was. His eyes flicked between Sarah and Emma, the weight of his lies finally catching up to him. The tension in the room was palpable now. Guests had stopped their conversations, all eyes focused on the confrontation playing out in front of them. David, who had made the toast earlier, stood watching with a look of concern, but no one dared to step in. Finally, Emma spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I never meant for this to happen, Sarah. I'm so sorry." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as the confirmation hit her like a physical blow. She had known, deep down, but hearing the words from Emma's mouth was like tearing open a wound. The betrayal was real. The life she had built with Mike was crumbling before her eyes. Mike stepped closer, his voice low and pleading. "Sarah, it was a mistake. It didn't mean anything. I messed up, okay? But we can get through this. We can fix it." But Sarah shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. "A mistake?" she repeated, her voice thick with emotion. "You call this a mistake? You brought her into our home, into our lives, and you lied to me. You lied to our children." Mike reached for her hand, but Sarah pulled away, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Everything she had feared, everything she had tried to ignore, was true. The man she had loved and trusted had betrayed her in the worst way possible. "And you," Sarah said, turning to Emma, her voice shaking with anger and pain. "You were like family to us. I trusted you. I trusted you with my children." Emma's lip trembled and she whispered again, "I'm sorry." "Sorry?" Sarah's voice cracked as the emotions overwhelmed her. "You've destroyed everything." The room was silent now, the guests looking on in stunned silence. No one moved. No one spoke. The celebration had transformed into a spectacle, and Sarah stood at the center of it, her world collapsing around her. For a moment, no one knew what to do. Mike stood helplessly, his charm and excuses failing him for the first time. Emma's guilt was written all over her face, and Sarah's heart was breaking. She had thought tonight would be a celebration of love, but instead it had become the moment when everything she believed in was shattered. The silence in the room was unbearable. The party that had once been filled with laughter and celebration was now an audience to the painful unraveling of Sarah's life. Eyes that once sparkled with joy were now wide with shock, and the air was thick with tension. The truth was out, and there was no turning back. Sarah stood at the center of it all, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She had spent weeks, maybe even months, ignoring the signs, but now everything was out in the open. Mike stood next to her, his usual confidence shattered, his charm useless in the face of the truth. Emma, standing a few feet away, looked pale, her face filled with guilt and shame. Mike broke the silence first. "Sarah," he said softly, his voice pleading, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to happen this way. It was a mistake. Please, let's talk about this in private." But Sarah wasn't interested in privacy anymore. For too long she had kept her suspicions and her pain hidden behind closed doors, pretending that everything was fine. Now, in front of their friends, family, and everyone who had come to celebrate their love, she was done pretending. "No, Mike," Sarah said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "We're not doing this in private. I've been in the dark for too long. I've been lied to, betrayed, and humiliated, and I won't let you sweep this under the rug." Her words cut through the room like a knife, and the guests shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to do. Some glanced at each other, while others looked at the ground, trying to avoid the unfolding drama. But no one dared to intervene. Mike looked desperate now, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "Sarah, please," he begged. "I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But we can fix this. We can work through it." But Sarah wasn't swayed. The anger and hurt that had been simmering inside her for weeks had reached its boiling point. "Work through it," she repeated, her voice trembling with disbelief. "How do you expect me to work through this, Mike? How do you expect me to forgive you when you've lied to me over and over again?" Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had spent enough time crying in silence, and now, in front of everyone, she needed to be strong. She turned her gaze to Emma, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her eyes downcast. "And you," Sarah said, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and heartbreak. "You were part of our family. I trusted you. I trusted you with my children, with everything. How could you do this?" Emma looked up, her eyes filled with tears. "Sarah, I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I never wanted to hurt you." But Sarah wasn't looking for apologies. She wasn't looking for excuses. "You never wanted to hurt me," Sarah repeated, her voice rising. "Well, you did. You've destroyed my family, and nothing you say can fix that." The room was deathly silent, the guests too shocked to speak. David, Mike's friend, who had been the first to make a toast earlier, stepped forward hesitantly. "Sarah," he said gently, "maybe we should all take a step back. This is a lot to handle right now. Let's take a breath and talk things through." But Sarah shook her head, her resolve unwavering. "No," she said firmly. "There's nothing left to talk about. This marriage is over." The words hung in the air, final and heavy. Mike's face fell, his shoulders slumping as the weight of Sarah's decision sank in. He had lost her. The woman he had built a life with, the mother of his children, was done with him, and there was nothing he could say or do to change it. Sarah took a deep breath, her chest tightening with the overwhelming mix of emotions. She was ready to move forward. The murmurs of the guests behind her were barely audible as she moved through the room, each step feeling heavier than the last. This was supposed to be a night of celebration, but it had turned into a public unraveling of her life. She reached the exit of the venue and paused for a moment, looking back at the scene she was leaving behind. Mike stood in the center of the room, his face pale and filled with regret. He seemed frozen, unsure of what to do or say, as if still hoping for a way to fix the damage he had caused. But Sarah knew there was no fixing it. The trust between them had been irreparably shattered. Emma stood a few feet away from Mike, her face streaked with tears. She looked broken, filled with guilt and shame. But that did little to soothe Sarah's pain. The betrayal was too deep. Sarah had trusted her with her children, her home, and her family, and Emma had taken advantage of that trust in the worst possible way. There was no forgiveness here, not tonight. The guests watched in stunned silence, their expressions ranging from shock to sympathy. Some of them had been friends for years, witnessing the highs and lows of Sarah and Mike's marriage, but now they were witnessing its collapse, and no one knew what to do. The weight of the moment hung over the room like a thick cloud, suffocating everyone in its wake. For a brief moment, Sarah felt a pang of embarrassment. This wasn't how she had envisioned her marriage ending, and certainly not in front of everyone she knew. But the truth was out now, and in a strange way, it was liberating. She didn't have to hide anymore, didn't have to pretend that everything was perfect when it was falling apart behind closed doors. The lies had been exposed, and with them, the chains that had bound her to a life of deceit had been broken. With one final glance at Mike, Sarah turned and walked out of the venue, the cool night air hitting her face like a rush of freedom. She could breathe again, even if the pain in her chest was still raw. As she walked down the steps and into the quiet of the evening, she realized that she was leaving behind more than just a party. She was leaving behind a life that no longer existed. But that didn't mean the road ahead would be easy. In fact, Sarah knew that the hardest part was yet to come. She would have to face her children and explain what had happened. How could she tell them that their father had betrayed her, betrayed all of them? The thought of their innocent faces and the pain this would cause them brought fresh tears to her eyes, but she blinked them back. She couldn't break down, not yet. Not until she had faced the hardest conversation of her life. As Sarah made her way home, her mind raced with a mix of emotions: anger, hurt, sadness, and strangely, relief. For weeks, she had been living in a state of constant doubt, questioning everything, unsure of what was real and what was a lie. But now, at least, she knew the truth. It was painful, but it was also freeing. The worst had happened, and she had survived it. Back at the house, Sarah stepped inside, the familiar surroundings suddenly feeling foreign and cold. The home she had built with Mike, filled with memories of their life together, now felt empty. Every corner, every room, reminded her of the love they had once shared, and the betrayal that had torn it apart. She sat down on the couch, her hands trembling slightly as the weight of the evening settled in. Her mind replayed the events over and over. The confrontation with Emma, Mike's pleading eyes, the guests' shocked faces. She felt drained, both physically and emotionally, but there was no time to fall apart. Not yet. The babysitter would be dropping off the kids soon, and Sarah needed to pull herself together. She had to be strong for them, even if she wasn't sure how she would get through the conversation that awaited. How could she tell them the truth without breaking their hearts? As the minutes ticked by, Sarah took a deep breath and tried to steady herself. She had faced the truth, and now it was time to deal with the consequences. The life she had known was over, but there was still a future to build, a future for her and her children, without Mike. It would be hard, but Sarah was determined to get through it. She had no other choice. The next morning, Sarah woke up to a quiet house. The weight of the previous night's events pressed down on her, but there was a strange sense of calm in the air. The truth was out, and there was no more pretending. The kids were still asleep, unaware of the turmoil that had unfolded. Soon, she would have to explain what had happened, why their father wouldn't be coming home. The thought weighed heavily on her, but she knew she had to be strong for them. There was no turning back now. Sitting at the kitchen table, Sarah felt the emptiness of the house around her. The home she had built with Mike now felt like a shell, filled with memories of a life that no longer existed. But as painful as the betrayal had been, it also brought a certain clarity. Sarah knew she couldn't rebuild the past, but she could shape her future. She wasn't going to let this break her. The sound of small footsteps broke her thoughts, and her children appeared, still sleepy but full of life. Her heart tightened, knowing she would soon have to break the news to them. But for now, she smiled and began making breakfast, trying to hold on to the moments of normalcy that remained. After breakfast, Sarah sat the children down, her heart pounding. She chose her words carefully, her voice calm but firm. "There's something I need to talk to you about," she began. "Last night, your dad and I had a difficult conversation, and things are going to change." The kids looked at her with wide eyes, not fully understanding the gravity of the situation. "Your dad made some mistakes," Sarah continued, swallowing the lump in her throat. "He won't be living with us anymore, but I want you to know that we both love you very much, and nothing will ever change that." The silence that followed was heartbreaking. Her children didn't fully grasp the situation, but Sarah could see the worry in their eyes. They asked if their dad was leaving for good, and Sarah nodded, tears threatening to spill over. "He needs some time away," she said gently, "but we'll get through this together." As she held them close, the weight of the moment settled over her. Her marriage was over, but her role as their mother would never change. They needed her now more than ever, and she was determined to be their rock.